Drones have become a key part of U.S. military strategy. They are seen as cheap, accurate, and also low risk compared to manned warplanes and missiles. Countries around the world have also been eager to take advantage of the technology. The U.S. has faced a backlash over civilian deaths in drone attacks, and there are concerns that drone tech in a way spread, so will the misuse of the weapon system. But no international norms have been developed so far to regulate the use of military drones. About 2 weeks ago, in fact, U.S. President Barack Obama apologized for a counterterrorism operation in January that accidentally killed 2 aid workers held hostage by al-Qaeda, 1 American and 1 Italian.
I profoundly regret what happened. On behalf of the United States government, I offer our deepest apologies to the families. It is a cruel and bitter truth that in the fog of war generally and our fight against terrorists specifically, mistakes, sometimes deadly mistakes, can occur.
Well, that's President Obama from the United States. And now with me once again, we still have Victor Gao, Ambassador Ahmed, and also Mr. Crowley. Military use of the drone is even more complicated than the civilian debate. Mr. Crowley, the U.S. is both the innovator and now the one that has to be responsible for the deaths of some innocent killings of civilians as a result of the drones. Help us to understand, with your knowledge of the government, where is that debate going?
Well, I think we're focused on the wrong issue, quite honestly. A drone is an aircraft. It's not necessarily substantially different than a fighter aircraft, and the function of delivering a weapon on a target is not necessarily different than a missile battery. The issue, what's changing, is the nature of warfare and also technology. But we are moving from conflicts that primarily involve 2 states to conflicts that are involve either conflicts inside a state, or in the case of al-Qaeda, a conflict between a state, the United States, for example, and a non-state actor, al-Qaeda. So I do think that because drone technology is to some extent part of the transformation of the nature of warfare, we do need to have an understanding of what sovereignty means in today's conflict situation, whether we're talking about a drone or we're talking about cyber warfare. The nature of sovereignty is changing,
right.
The nature of threats are changing, and then so how you apply technology to these threats is a matter that should be part of a larger international debate.
Right. May I just follow up a little bit, Mr. Crowley? While that debate is taking place, while civilian side, you've already seen regulations coming out limiting the use of drones. But the thing is, what about military drones? Are we going to consider those dead innocently just being quote unquote collateral damage and therefore let it be? Or are we going to come up with much more stricter use of the drones and much accurate information so that the civilian deaths will be limited as much as possible? I'm afraid we have to do the latter. Have we done the latter though?
Well, I would say 2 things. First of all, I think my government has to be far more transparent about the employment of drones than it has been up to this point. Having said that, though, think back to the Iraq War in 2003. There are a variety of estimates of the impact on the Iraqi population when you introduce 150,000 soldiers into a conflict zone. But the estimates are, 100,000 or more Iraqis died, during the 8-year conflict that we in America called, the Iraq War.
All right.
If you compare that to the use of drones, there's no question there's a civilian impact, but the impact is actually significantly lower, than it is in traditional conflict. So
I got your point.
But I do think there's no question that there needs to be a larger conversation about the application of this technology into very changing conflict environments.
Now let's have Ambassador Ahmed to respond to that. You are from Pakistan. You know this very well during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Pakistan suffered also collateral damage. The point, I think, from Mr. Crowley, several things. Let me just repeat them in a very brief way so that our audience would also get them. One is, well, when you send military, real people onto the ground, you also kill innocent ones. And drones probably kill even fewer. Secondly, this is the suffering of the enemies, or at least the people that are in the country where the enemies are, not necessarily the American troops, because drones without any pilots and without any soldiers from the United States. And thirdly, this is how the war has been evolved, and therefore we have to accept it as a fact, even though improvements can be made. Ambassador Ahmed, I want you to respond to all of these points, if possible.
Thank you. I think these are really important questions, and I'm really grateful to CCTV for raising the issue of drones. I think this is a very important debate. There's one huge flaw in what Secretary Crawley, and I have great respect for him, has just presented. He's assuming, as do a lot of people who discuss the issue, that there are two actors to this, the United States and the non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and Taliban and so on. What is omitted from the discussion is that there is a third actor, and that is the local state. So Pakistan is involved, and Pakistan has been extremely unhappy, if you read the statements of prime ministers and political leaders, in the fact that its sovereign space is constantly violated, that you have drone strikes taking place in its territory without permission, without notice. Now, there may be some covert agreement that we don't know about. As President Obama said, there is a fog of war hanging over this whole enterprise, and in this case, a particularly thick fog of war. The reality is that drones are used to kill people in Waziristan. We have no idea how these targets are selected. We have no idea what the process is. We have no idea really how many people die, how many totally innocent people die. We do know, because in my book, The Thistle and the Drone, I actually interviewed people on the ground, and we actually gave case studies where so many completely innocent people were killed.
Okay.
For example, that famous Jirga, which took place a few years ago in Datta in North Waziristan. I interviewed the brigadier who was in charge of that area on the border a few miles from Datta Khel, and he said he knew about it. It was a peaceful gathering to resolve a commercial dispute.
Mr. Ambassador.
And 44 people had gathered.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, let me just follow up just very briefly about what you said. You mentioned some examples, but the thing is, without these kind of drones, how can some of the achievements as made in the war in Afghanistan, for example, be made in a way? Because it is, some argue, impossible without this modern kinds of technology. And they also argue, if the US side was informing the Pakistani side, maybe information would be leaked, and therefore, quote unquote, those terrorists might flee, and therefore the whole warfare came to a failure. Your argument, very briefly from you before we go to the Chinese guests, we have 2 minutes left, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, the consequence of this argument was that Pakistanis who were not involved on 9/11, had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and so on, have lost so far almost 60,000 people killed in this war on terror. And that is why a lot of them are very upset. The economy is in a mess. There's total breakdown of law and order. The TTP has emerged, conducting suicide bombs. So we need to be much more sensitive in treating each other more like human beings, more with sympathy, more with compassion. Because ultimately, if you're aiming to kill 5 people, you may kill 5 people, but you may end up by losing another 5,000 who may go and join the enemy, and you have more suicide bombers.
I see.
And where will this violence end?
Okay, Mr. Gao, here in Beijing. I do get your point, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Gao, here in Beijing, let me ask you about this, because you see already two sides on two different sides of the conflict, even though they're working together against the terrorists. But on the issue of drones, this is certainly very controversial. There's evolving of the warfare today, the quote unquote, who's the enemy, and also the technology militarily. What do you make of this, and where does China stand?
Well, first of all, I would say the drones are going to stay with us for a long time, and drone technologies will evolve very quickly, revolutionizing very quickly. Secondly, while we need to do everything we can to promote the constructive use of drones, we need to come up with a regulatory framework, as quickly as possible. If sovereign states have impunity in launching airstrikes by using drones, the consequence is if the wrong side of the equation, the terrorists, for example, the extremists get their hands on the drone and launch similar attack on civilian target or government targets, what will be your argument? So I think sovereign states, while having legitimate interest in punishing the terrorists, need to avoid having the sense of impunity in launching drone attacks.
This is certainly a very complicated issue. It involves international law, it involves the technology development, it involves all of these equal debates among countries. Obviously more complicated than be handled just within 15 minutes as we did. But we want to thank the three of you gentlemen for your input and all your case studies. Thank you so much. Ambassador Akbar Ahmed in Washington, D.C., and also together with Mr. Philip Crowley, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. State Department here in Beijing, Mr. Gao Zhikai, Victor Gao here. Thank you so much.